Sneaky with the foot. You've mastered this thing already. Yeah. We're going in-house today. One of the members of our own community is presenting the main talk. Sometimes we have outside the community. Today it's inside the community. Brian Schrock, who basically does not need an introduction to you all, but he deserves one. Brian studied geology and geography in college, and he has worked and volunteered under the natural sciences umbrella here in Houston. He is a longtime Oasian and a Texas master naturalist. And he's going to come here today to talk to us more about days of Houston past. And let's give a warm welcome to our friend Brian.
Did you get the lights? Yeah. All right, I'm going to jump right in because I have a lot to cover. And first, let me give you a quick background about me. As Mike said, my degree is in geoscience, but I minored in geography. I first worked in geochemistry, then for a nonprofit tree nursery, then for the city's Parks and Rec department. And now I'm working for the stormwater maintenance branch for the city in my high tower up there. But yeah, I'm also a recently certified Texas Master Naturalist, and that's where a lot of this information is coming from. So no matter what I've been doing, I've been under a broad range of things, usually involved in natural sciences or geography. And through these various courses, professions, certifications, I've had opportunities to see my hometown from new perspectives and explore its past in ways that have kind of smashed my original understanding of this place we call Houston. So this is John Audubon, famous for birds. He's also a naturalist, and during his journeys, he visited the Houston area a year after its founding. And I think you'll all get a kick out of some of his descriptions that he writes in his journal. So I'm going to read them to you. On May 15th, we landed at Houston, the capital of Texas, drenched to the skin, and were kindly received on board the steamer Yellowstone by Captain West, who gave us his stateroom to change our clothes and furnished us refreshments and dinner. The Buffalo Bayou had risen about 6 feet, and the neighboring prairies were partly covered with water. There was a wild and desolate look cast on the surrounding scenery. We had already passed 2 little girls encamped on the bank of the bayou under the cover of a few clapboards, cooking a scanty meal. Shanties, cargoes of hogshead, barrels, etc. were spread about the landing, and Indians, drunk and hallooing, were stumbling about in the mud in every direction. These poor beings had come here to enter into a treaty proposed by the whites. Many of them were young and well-looking, and with far less decorations than I have seen before on such occasions. The chief of the tribe is an old and corpulent man. We walked towards the president's house, accompanied by the Secretary of the Navy, and as soon as we rose above the bank, we saw before us a level of far-extending prairie, destitute of timber. Did you catch that? A level of far-extending prairie, destitute of timber, and of rather poor soil. Houses, half-finished and most of them without roofs, tents, and a liberty pole with the Capitol were all exhibited to our view at once. We approached the president's mansion, however, wading through water above our ankles. This abode of President Houston is a small log house consisting of 2 rooms and a passage through after the southern fashion. The moment we stepped over the threshold on the right hand of the passage, we found ourselves ushered into what in other countries would be called the antechamber. The ground floor, however, was muddy and filthy. A large fire was burning, a small table covered with paper and writing materials was in the center, camp beds, trunks, and different materials were strewed around the room. So before I jump into everything that's changed, I wanted to quickly fly through the history of this area to give a sense of the time scale of our environmental change. And this is going to go pretty fast, but it won't all be this quick. So the Krakatoa tribes inhabited the Houston area thousands of years before the first Europeans arrived in the 1500s. We know from archaeological evidence that they were oyster eaters, and because they were disposing of the shells in what we call shell middens. And because of this, we know they lived a migratory lifestyle as well, moving to the coast and barrier islands in the winter for oysters, and moving inland in the summer when oysters were no longer edible. They continued to remain largely unaffected by the European settlers until about the 1800s. But between the 1500s up until the early 1800s, the Spanish explorers, followed by Spanish missionaries, moved through parts of Texas. They were largely focused west and in parts of the piney woods, and didn't interact a whole lot with the Krakatoa along the coast. But from 1815 to 1821, Jean Lafitte, war hero slash pirate, had founded a pirate colony around Galveston Bay and Galveston Island until he was ultimately chased out by the U.S. Navy. But he was one of the first Europeans to kind of settle in the area. And then in the 1820s, right afterwards, Mexico gained its independence from Spain, became the first Mexican empire and then the first Mexican republic. And shortly after that, Stephen F. Austin arrives, gains permission from Mexico to start a colony in southeast Texas, and then subsequently doesn't get permission and essentially starts a war with Mexico. And hooray, we have Houston. Let's continue. Right after the war in 1837, John Kirby Allen and his brother Augustus Chapman Allen founded the city of Houston at the confluence of Buffalo Bayou and White Oak Bayou, which is about 1 mile outside our window right here. They used a lot of exaggerated language to try and appeal to Americans on the East Coast to move here. It was a lot muddier when they arrived. Through the rest of the century, Texas joins the U.S., leaves the U.S. for the Confederacy, rejoins the U.S., but all the while, Galveston is outpacing Houston and growing into a major port city to rival New Orleans until that happened. Hurricane. Galveston is crippled, scaring investors and businesses further inland to Houston, where they subsequently get permission from the president to begin a massive infrastructure project to widen Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River into the Houston Ship Channel. And by another stroke of good fortune, oil is discovered near Baytown and the population booms. In the later half of the 20th century, Houston becomes the home of NASA's Mission Control, bringing a massive aerospace industry to the area. It is also gaining a major medical center and becoming the home of major petrochemical companies. And with all these major industries comes all the associated banks and law firms and businesses and the population. And with the population comes extensive housing, restaurants, universities, schools, sports teams, and it forms the 4th largest city in the US, probably soon to be the 3rd largest. Take that, Chicago. All right, now I can slow it down a little bit. So here's a map that shows the general layout of the Houston area and the ecosystems around Houston. At the top, you can see the piney woods there, the teal color. And then in the bright green down near the bottom is our coastal prairie. And then all the orange is what they list on here as crops and former prairie. And then some of those green areas south of us near Fort Brenne, that's the Brazos River and the river basins. Those are pecan and elm forests. And then all the light blue is like our marsh and wetland. So that big gray area is our urban center of Houston. And I'm not sure when this map was made, but it definitely goes out quite a bit further than that. You can see it just kind of breaking out of the beltway in this picture. So to give an example of just how much we've changed in like the last 30 years, this is aerial imagery from 1984. And this is the northwest side of Houston, where if you're going to Mike's birthday, you might want to memorize this map, because it's hard to find. If you see that one bright white oval kind of on the right side near the top, that's Willowbrook Mall. So watch as 30 years go by. So catch that again. Here's 84. Here's last year. You can see they added 99 out there. On the same side, this is the southwest side of the city. You can just barely see our downtown at the very top right. And you can sort of make out 610 there. But look at all that farmland and prairie at the bottom and the Brazos River down there. Here's what it looks like today.
Wow.
And here's my side of town, along the bay. You see the Clear Lake and Friendswood area in the middle, but south of us to Alvin, there's still gaps in farmland, and that's all filling in. So obviously things have changed quite a bit since Audubon, the Allen brothers, Stephen F. Austin, the Spanish and the Cronquist were here, but where do these changes start? So let me talk real quickly about native species, introduced species, and invasive species, which Mandy kind of led me into. The casual definition of a native species is one that scientists have considered to be an original inhabitant to the area, and an introduced or non-native was brought here on purpose or on accident, usually by human activity. And invasive can be, it doesn't have to be an introduced species, and invasive can also be a native that now has new conditions that allow it to grow and spread. And it's not just plants, we're talking about animals as well, like our fire ants. So here's a good example of a native that's not invasive. This is the green milkweed. It's a favorite among monarchs, and other insects. It's native to our area. It has many benefits to other native species, and it is not invasive. You won't find it overtaking empty lots all over the city. This is the southern hackberry tree, also called a sugarberry. They're really common throughout Texas, particularly the small forests that surround rivers and bayous. And many of our native animals love them, which in turn spreads their seeds all over. You'll see them popping up almost anywhere that a bird takes a poo, especially along fence lines. And but our presence has allowed them to grow where they didn't used to, giving them somewhat of an invasive quality. So they're still a good species, but they have invaded into many areas. And I'll explain a little bit why in a few minutes. They are native, yeah. So here's a non-native, non-invasive that you probably all recognize. It's originally from India. This is the Crape Myrtle. Its invasive potential is pretty small. You won't see them overtaking empty lots, and maybe only because they're outcompeted by other invasive species. And how many of you recognize this thing? Yeah, this is the Chinese tallow tree. In fact, there's one above that red car right out there. It's non-native, highly, highly invasive, and probably the most common tree by mass now in the Houston area. It's notoriously hard to kill and has very little benefit to our native species. We used to plant them for their unique leaves because they get a nice red fall color, and then because of their quick growth. So, if you think back to Audubon's description of a vast prairie devoid of trees, why do so many of our natural areas look like this picture here? Why are all of these woody plants, even our native hackberry, invading these empty lots? This is a picture I took near Ellington Field, but you can see this all around the city. To better illustrate this, here's some imagery from Attucks Reservoir. In 1952, we can kind of see the prairie ecosystem that was in that area. And the dark spots are the prairie potholes where they're wet most of the year. And you can see that there are some trees along the bayou there, and that's the only place they're really growing. But if we skip ahead to 1988, or 1977, I'm sorry, this area is filling in with trees and other woody plants. So let me go back. You can see the dark spots, especially at the top, start to fill in. And then by 1988, almost the whole thing is wooded. So almost all the former prairie is gone to be replaced by these woods. And it's because something went missing. Prior to settlement, this is the rate that the Houston area is getting burned crispy by fires. At least once every 2 years. One of the highest rates in the nation. We've always been wet and humid, so why are we catching fire so often? And a lot of it could be because of the lightning we get. We get a lot more lightning than most other parts of the country. We also have the wind and the density of our grasses and prairies, the frequency of our dry spells. It probably all works together. But we burned a lot. These days we do everything we can to protect against that for obvious reasons. The prairies thrive on fires though. The deep-rooted grasses that grew on prairies could survive a quick blaze and produce new growth. Woody plants don't react so well to being burned alive. Those frequent fires kept woody plants from growing old enough to produce seed, leaving the prairie grassy. A couple other things that are really altered by the species we see today. Obviously, urbanization is a big one, but our surrounding rural areas were also being modified by ranching. You can't make a living if your livestock are being eaten by predators, so you know those predators are going to have to move elsewhere. But also, you want the best grass feed for your longhorn, so you bring in the fast-growing, fast-spreading grass from who knows where, and pretty soon it's now spreading across all of our Texas roadsides, having to be mowed on a regular basis. Here's something you probably recognize if you've lived here in the past 2 or 3 years. Houston is built on a lot of impermeable clay. So while some places may drain their rain into the groundwater, our rain leaves us through our bayous and stream channels. This is actually the FEMA floodplain map for our area. As you can see, it takes up almost all of our city. Like, we're a city that floods, and it's always going to be that way. And if you look at the bottom of 610 there in the Meyerland area, you hear so much about Meyerland's flooding. A lot of it is because they're in the 100-year flood zone. Does anyone recognize that building that's circled in green? It's the one we're in right now. So notice how natural and curvy White Oak Bayou is right below us. Around this time, it was very obvious that our city was going to be consistently flooded. And we started looking for ways around that. So we straightened our bayous, we filled them with cement, took out as much of the vegetation as we could. The idea seems pretty sound. You take away everything that can slow down the water, and you shorten its path to the Gulf. It goes out just as fast as it came. You lose the natural beauty, but we don't solve anymore, or we don't flood anymore, right? Oh yeah, and a quick PSA, I thought I would get some brownie points from the board if I posted that we do have parking out back. It's now confirmed through aerial imagery. So back to flooding and channelization. Now I've crossed out the technical words, mostly so we can just focus on the graph here. But one of the effects of channelizing the bayous is that the flow rate of the water is greatly increased, and that's that dashed line there. When you live upstream, this is great news. The water drains away from you really quickly. But when you live downstream, that water all comes directly to you, resulting not only in more flooding, but fast flooding. And with a natural stream channel, the water still rises, and this is the solid line. The water still rises, some places may flood, but water will drain slowly from upstream to downstream, releasing much more slowly into Galveston Bay. And that brings us to the other detrimental effect of channelization, which is pollution and sediment runoff. Our bay is a major ecosystem, with oysters, fish, birds, and wetland plants. They all operate together to keep our bay healthy, especially the oysters, which naturally filter the water. The increased runoff brings with it a lot of sediment and bacteria that can cause algal blooms and devastate the bay ecosystem and kill large reefs of oysters. And this headline is actually in response to the second year in a row of flooding, where the resulting freshwater dropped the salinity of the bay so low that it killed many oysters. These freshwater surges would probably still happen without us being here, but it's those years in between that we have an effect on it and they don't get a chance to recover. So even in a drought, the salinity will then rise. It has the opposite effect. But in those years between, the sediment and the pollution devastates the populations, and each year it's harder and harder for them to come back. So one thing that keeps our bay healthy are these vast wetlands that surround the bay. And the wetland plants there filter out many pollutants and help slow down and catch the sediment before it moves further out into the bay. They're also important breeding ground for many of our aquatic creatures. Development along the ship channel has removed a lot of the wetland plants, but something else has happened to the wetlands during the last century that seems rather counterintuitive. They drowned. And how do you think a wetland drowns? Subsidence. So the growing need for fresh water in the Houston region, both for human consumption and support for the oil industry, drove us to pump away at our sandy aquifers. A lot of the core of Houston sank around 6 feet, whereas the surrounding area in the ship channel sank around upwards of 10 feet. And this is all as the aquifers are compacting. So here's the Brownwood neighborhood in Baytown, which is right along the ship channel in 1943. In 1978, after sinking about 10 feet, this is what it looked like. And here it is today, now a nature center because it's unlivable. Here's Armand Bayou, which is really familiar to me. I spent a lot of time going to this place when I was younger. Has anyone else been out there? So do you recognize that little tiny creek? Yeah, that's not a tiny creek anymore. It's really wide. We sank a bayou, and that's pretty impressive. And if you go out there today, in fact, this is a zoomed in picture of it, you can see that some of those trees are still there in the water, but they're dead and they're basically just a trunk. And if you try and kayak out there, you'll occasionally run into one. So we introduced species, we stopped the fires, we channelized the bayous, and we sank the city, and we sank a bayou. So did we do anything else? You know we did. So Houston's local climate is affected by the urban heat island effect. Concrete does a really good job of storing heat, which is really noticeable at nighttime. After the sun goes down and the surrounding natural areas cool, the urban areas still radiate heat. And this has an interesting effect on more than just our temperature. At night, and prior to urbanization, the land temperature would fall below the adjacent sea temperature, and this difference in temperature would create a strong offshore breeze out towards the Gulf of Mexico. But today, now that Houston stays warmer through the night, we get a much weaker breeze, which may be keeping air pollution from dispersing away from us. So a lot of the other changes are pretty obvious to our senses. From the ground level, we'll never see as far as Audubon could see across our landscape. Things smell quite a bit different, and I'm sorry, Baytown, for picking on you. I could have picked on Channel View or Pasadena as well. And things are noisier. Traffic, construction, sirens, AC units, these sounds are very familiar to us, but they block out a lot of the natural sound that we had here. So things have changed, and what can we do? We can't get millions of people to move away. Maybe we'll find a way to cool off our city, but probably not to previous temperatures, and especially not while facing climate change. We can't unsubside ourselves back up a few feet. We can unchannel the bayous, but it would take millions of dollars, and it would take thousands of years to naturally redevelop the sinuous shape. We can try to contain our invasive species, but we can't get rid of them all, and we definitely can't go around setting everything on fire every couple of years. So what we can do is preserve what's left at places like the Katy Prairie, the Deer Park Prairie, the Armand Bayou Nature Center, and others, and restore native plants to protected lands like Exploration Green and the M. Anderson Pocket Prairie. And I want to show you this and finish with it. This is a shot of a magical place called the Nash Prairie. It's located pretty close to Brazos Bend and is known amongst local naturalists as being one of the only remaining pristine prairies in our area. It has never been grazed, and it has avoided invasive species. It is routinely given a controlled burn to keep it pristine and is providing the seeds for other restoration projects at places like the Katy Prairie, M.D. Anderson Pocket Prairie, and more. If you wanted to see what John Audubon saw when he wrote about Houston, this is probably the closest image I could give you. Now just use your imagination to add the sounds of insects and birds, the smell of native grasses and flowers, and the feeling of strong nighttime breezes. And the only way to see it as beautiful as it is to get out in it and be a part of it. And I hope you can see the beauty in this rare original Houston. I'm always happy to direct you to a volunteer project near you, or offer advice on native landscaping, or just recommend a great place to get outdoors, and I'm happy to go with you. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
If you have a lot of questions, we're going to try to use the mic today so everybody can hear the questions. We'll start with Steve.
I guess this is more of a cultural, it's a political question than a science question. Although I grew up in Beaumont, only an hour and a half east of here. And I've always noticed that always feels cooler only an hour and a half east here because it's a little bit more rural than Houston is. But I've been living in Houston, I guess 16, 17 years now. And one of the vibes, at least inside the loop or inside the beltway, I have gotten, maybe it's just we've gotten denser popular, we just grew more people. It seems to me that the vibe I get, and I could be wrong, I think Houston and the political thing in Houston is more progressive when I'm out and about than it was 16 and 17 years ago. It just feels, sometimes I feel like I'm in Los Angeles. And I don't feel like I'm in a southern state sometimes when I'm out and about in Houston. I don't know, do you feel that vibe or is it just me?
I definitely think Houston is progressive, but we're also an oil town, and we probably will be even through the ups and downs of the industry. And there's so many people here, there's only so much space you can give to natural areas if you want people to not continue spreading dozens of miles out of town. But there are a lot of groups here, tons of nonprofits that are doing great work to restore a lot of this stuff. And I think I've seen myself a lot of attitudes change on things like channelizing bayous, on protecting some prairies. So I'm not discouraged by all of this. Like, I think we are going to see a better direction, and it's just going to take a lot of stuff like this, changing opinions, getting out in it.
I was wondering if you knew kind of how Houston compared to a lot of other cities in this respect, because from a layman's point of view, even though Houston has a bad reputation for urban sprawl, it seems like we're doing a relatively good job of preserving and encouraging green spaces within the city. So I wanted to know if Houston's doing a particularly bad job or if just cities in general are bad for the surrounding environment.
I always see a lot of mixed answers on this because on one hand I'll get stuff from, like the city and other pages that are wanting to promote that, hey, we just got ranked like the city with the best parks in the nation. And then I'll see other reports saying that Houston ranks number 87 out of major cities for green space. And so I guess it depends on how you measure it. I think right now we've got good people in a position to encourage like what I would call like really native natural areas. So instead of just like a park, they're including pollinator gardens, prairies, wanting to preserve things like wetlands. And because like Houston does have lots of parks, we have playgrounds, we have places to play, but they are just fields. And we've planted invasive trees and stuff in them. So it's a balance, I guess. I wouldn't say we're the greatest by any stretch, but we do have our fair share of places that I think are really great to get out into and see some of this stuff.
So I was curious if from a naturalist perspective, was the big project they did through the city with the bayou, was that done well, or was that not?
Are you talking about the Buffalo Bayous particularly? So that's I really like it. I think they've done a great job to keep the trails in there, and I like that they've built it there knowing it was going to be a park that would flood all the time. And it's pretty fascinating to watch it get covered in like dirt and sand after a flood, and then it goes down and immediately crews just like shovel it all off and make it a park again. But I mean, our bayous are really important, and I love that Buffalo Bayou has remained unchannelized, and it brings people out there to see it and feel like it's more of a natural river. Like you go out here, it's nice if you walk down this trail right here, but you're still looking at cement and a mowed lawn. So, but no, I think it was good, and I think continuing to put the trails around the bayous is a great idea.
Too far away, just project.
So I went to listen to a talk from Mayor Turner recently, and apparently we have a flood czar here in Houston now. That's his main job is trying to prevent flooding. Do you have any idea, like you mentioned, we've got impermeable clay, and I know, I guess, also putting down more concrete probably doesn't help the situation, but what are we doing, what can we do so that I don't lose my car like I did last year in the flooding? Like, what are we doing, what can we do?
Yeah, Steve Costello is the flood czar, and he pops up on my floor now and then. I haven't worked with him yet, but I've run into him in the elevator. Like I was saying earlier, like there is a new approach really to just get everything cleaned up early to try and make sure that when floods come, we're not finding out, oh, hey, the street floods before, we have it all spatially organized. We have the maps of it. We know where it floods. So I guess right now it's just a matter of trying to attack all these spots, make sure that they drain. But some of it, like Ireland, for instance, I don't think there's really any solution there. Like eventually people are just going to move out of that area. And there's just some places we can't build because, you repair it somewhere and it just goes further somewhere else. And, if you really want to get into it, you could find the topographic maps of your area, find the high spot, and when you know it's going to rain, go park your car over there.
Okay, we probably ought to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Brian, Schrock, for your fascinating